Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the Academy's Anniversary Symposium. This final panel session on the ways forward for the social sciences in Australia. My name's Chris Hutley, I'm CEO of the Academy, and I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra. It's been an inspiring couple of days for those who've been able to join us prior to this session. We've had equal parts inspiration, some grounding in reality and some sobering presentations, some challenging and thought-provoking sessions as well. So if you haven't managed to get to all of the sessions, you'll get a good summary of the implications now and in our closing remarks from our Symposium Organising Committee Chair. But we will also have copies of the talks available on the Academy's YouTube channel in the coming days. So you can always go back and view some of the sessions later on. For this final session, it's my pleasure now to introduce the Academy's President-elect, Professor Richard Holden. Richard is a Professor of Economics at the UNSW Business School, and he is a frequent commentator and policy ideas man in the Australian popular discourse. So Richard, over to you.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you to you and the National Office and also Kevin McConkey, who we'll come back to, for doing such an amazing job organising this wonderful symposium into which a great deal of work goes. And I'm sure I speak for everyone when I say how much we've all enjoyed it. I am speaking today from lands of the Bidjigal people in what's now known as Sydney, and I want to acknowledge that before we start. I'm going to quickly introduce four people who need very little introduction, and then we're going to do something that we don't get to do, or at least I feel like I don't get to do often enough, which is reflect on some fairly broad and big themes that operate across the social sciences, even if we only get to do those for a relatively short period of time. To do that, I'm joined by four terrific scholars who I'm very grateful to have agreed to be part of this conversation. The first is Professor Glyn Davis. Glyn's the CEO of the Paul Ramsay Foundation and Distinguished Professor of Political Science in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He served as Vice-Chancellor of Griffith University and Melbourne University, among many other roles. Jane Hall is, Professor Jane Hall is Distinguished Professor of Health Economics at UTS and is President of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a Fellow of our Academy and also of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences. Dr. Dylan Leno is a Senior Lecturer at the University of Queensland Law School, and he works on research in constitutional law and colonialism, especially in their historical and theoretical contexts. And Scientia Professor Jane McAdam, the person among the panelists I think I've known for the longest, since we were both undergraduate university students ourselves. Jane, Scientia Professor and Director of the Caldor Centre for International Refugee Law at UNSW. So thank you all for joining us. Let's get straight in to the discussion. So I'm going to pose these questions to usually to one person in particular, but everyone's agreed to jump in and we'll go from there. So a bit's been made during these 2 days of the symposium about how one of the things in the social sciences is we don't always agree on the answers to every question. So while physicists, more or less agree that E equals mc squared, at least in the right context, we don't always agree on some of these concepts. Now, I think it's fair to say that we cover a range of different, not only disciplines, but disciplinary approaches. And perhaps that helps explain some of that lack of agreement at times. And sometimes we perhaps struggle to find a common language. Some people working on very technical and mathematical things, some people less so, and that there are a range of various different disciplinary backgrounds. Now, my question, and I'll pose this to you first, Glyn, is what does that disagreement, or if not disagreement, sort of lack of strong consensus, at least at times, mean for social scientists' contribution to the public conversation? Is this something to be managed or something to be celebrated or something to be ignored, or none of the above?
Thank you, Richard, and it's a delight to join you and fellow panellists. I'm on Wurundjeri country in the Kulin Nation. Let me do, as a number of colleagues have done during these 2 days, also acknowledge the loss of Stuart McIntyre yesterday, a really sad loss, and someone I worked with closely at the University of Melbourne, and I know will be much missed. Thank you for the question about common language. It has come up a number of times through the symposium. I'm not sure that physicists would agree that E equals mc squared. At least Milton Friedman, as I recall, did a really boots and all attack on physics methodology by arguing that it was no more precise than economics, which might say little about either. I'm actually not persuaded by this proposition around common language. And I'm thinking about the marches we saw in the capital cities last weekend, people waving banners, claiming discrimination because their jobs have made dependent on health, fitness, appropriating language from feminist discourse to argue about their bodies, claiming fundamental rights which don't appear anywhere in Australian law. And I find it hard to believe that if we had a common language and a clear and agreed way of explaining the world, that we would have made the slightest difference to that group of people who marched through. And the reason I think that is because, in fact, as was said in pretty strong terms in a couple of sessions this morning, social science isn't getting an audience. It isn't breaking through to the public discourse. It isn't part of the conversation. Imagine a world in which academics got to speak authoritatively on issues in a way that allowed them to be heard. It's not a world I can easily imagine. So only in exceptional circumstances like a global pandemic do we actually suddenly develop a common language. Look at the fact that many Australians now know what a ref rate is, which they would not have done before they heard from a lot of epidemiologists over 2 years. It didn't last long. All those voices disappeared from the public discourse the moment the immediate crisis had gone, and that's our choice. I think rather than a question of voice, it's a question of influence rather than common language. So the question is actually, and I know you're going to come to this, the absence of a public square, and I look forward to that discussion.
So Jane Hall, sort of Glenn's put this, I guess, sort of maybe I'd say half pessimistic, half optimistic view about, in a sense, about the cut through of the social sciences and the influence of the social sciences. And, the pandemic was a bad thing, but it was, as Glenn sort of suggested, arguably at least a time where social scientists did have a cut through in the public debate. What's your take on that as someone who spans health and economics and related disciplines? What's your take on sort of the optimism versus pessimism of our ability to cut through?
I'm going to say I'm a natural optimist, but one of the things that's occurred to me listening to so many interesting presentations over the last day and a half is that as social scientists, we have trained most of our public servants, most of our politicians, most of our leaders in society in very many ways, but particularly with the politicians, we're seeing this, what some would say is a backlash against the social sciences. We're seeing this downplaying of the value of the social sciences and the contribution of the social sciences. I remember when we were suffering those, so this is a previous crisis, fish kills in the Murray River. And it wasn't the science that needed to give us the answer. It was obvious that the fish couldn't breathe, but it was the social sciences that needed to say, why has regulation failed? I'm going to indulge myself a little bit, Richard, and say there's one other issue that I'd like to pick up on, which reflects into the media and how things are reported. And I remember a few years ago, I used to do a lot of media commentary, a little bit less being president of the Academy of Social Sciences due to other things that being president involves. But being rung up by a reporter for a comment on the state of private health insurance, which I gave them, they said, everybody says that. We can't use any of your quotes because everybody says that. And I said, but it's right. And the answer was, but we won't be seen to be providing a balanced view unless we can find someone with a different point of view. So not an answer really, but some comments to throw into our reflections.
So I think that's really interesting, and it reminds, it's going to sort of feed into the second question around social media and the public square. And I'll come to you, Jane McAdam, in just one second. But I'm reminded of Paul Krugman's aphorism about balance in public debate, saying that the media have a habit of writing headlines like "debate still rages about shape of Earth," and that even if almost everyone outside of politics happens to agree on a particular issue, and also social scientists and scientists even agree on an issue, the idea of there being competing sides to a story is incredibly important to, I guess, sell newspapers, get subscriptions, attract eyeballs, get clicks, and all that sort of stuff. And I guess we've seen in the context of the debate about the pandemic that some of the more controversial opinions and perhaps opinions that weren't agreed with by all that many people were given a good deal of prominence. So I guess I'm sympathetic to that view of how the media view things. Jane McAdam, you have a lot to do with the public square and public debate about, big issues where I'm not sure exactly how much public agreement there is about them, but from what you and others have explained to me, there's a good deal of academic agreement about them. How do you think about social scientists influencing the public conversation? And has that role changed, gotten harder, gotten easier as social media has perhaps done at least two things, which is it's in a sense democratized things by giving kind of anyone with an internet connection a voice, at least of some sort, if being able to tweet is a voice, but it's also sort of reduced the concept of a well-defined public square. What's your take on how social scientists can and do influence the public conversation?
Thanks, Richard. And I was actually going to begin by saying, I think, social media can be an equalizer, but at the same time, voices can get drowned out very quickly, or there can be a pile-on and people will, self-silence because they just don't want to be part of that and the trolling and so on that can come with it. I mean, I think what's certainly shifted in the time that I've run the Caldor Centre, which is the past 8 years, is that social media has become started playing a much bigger role than it had at the beginning. And so whereas I initially saw Twitter as just sort of this sideline thing, now it's absolutely crucial in terms of getting messages out there, promoting research that's being done, and in itself can be an effective way of communicating a series of ideas, through threads and the like. There have been occasions, for example, where I've known of people who've wanted to place an op-ed with a mainstream publication, haven't been able to do so. So instead have turned to Twitter and have had amazing, retweets and followings as a result of that. And it's been much, much faster and not edited in a way that might otherwise happen. But, I think too that there is this, we've seen during the pandemic, on the one hand, great respect for experts at certain times, and then at other times undercutting what they're saying, pitting people against one another, and thereby trying to, really call into question what it is that they're saying and how accurate it might be. And so I think too that, this notion of perceived subjectivity and how this translates into authority, that somehow every opinion is equal and valid, that's something that's challenging on social media. But even in the mainstream media, as you were saying, in some of the climate change debates, where a balanced view meant you had somebody who believed in climate change and someone who didn't, even though, as the scientists would tell you, the people who don't believe in climate change is an extremely small minority. So it's not balanced to have one and the other. And I think the other thing I just respond to, partly in relation to the first question you were asking, but also here, is that I think we need to remember that disagreement isn't in and of itself something that's unhealthy. It can be quite a healthy forum to spark debate, refine arguments, and reasoning, and generate new ideas. And very often it's what's in the grey areas that are the most interesting. So I think to the extent that that is possible, that's something that's valuable. But at the same time, I also see how that then just plays into the idea that there's no unanimity of viewpoints, and it's a free for all for anyone that wants to say something.
That's great, Dylan. At least relative to the rest of us on the panel today, you're at the sharper and more exciting end of your academic career. Given what you work on, how important do you think it is, just for you from your own personal perspective? How important is it to engage in public debate or public debates, or how much is for you being an academic about sort of doing your research and the rest of things taking care of themselves?
Right. Thanks so much for the question, Richard. I just want to acknowledge as well that I'm on Yuggera and Turrbal lands up in Meanjin or Brisbane. Look, I'm not someone who's actually, done a whole lot of media stuff outside of having a Twitter profile. And I haven't really sought that out either. I think when we think about, the influence that social scientists can have in public debate, I think we should be willing to think about that broadly, both kind of in terms of the sort of the outputs, I suppose, and also in terms of the timeframes of that. And I think actually for most of us, our main influence is actually not through our research or being a talking head or something like that. It's probably through our teaching, right? Over the course of our careers, training hundreds or thousands of students, in how to think about and understand the social world. Right, that I think is a pretty major influence that's not sort of easily quantifiable. It doesn't fit within the kind of the tight timeframes or the demand for identifiable outputs that we of the impact and engagement agenda that we see. But I think, that is probably the most significant impact that a lot of us will have on the public sphere and the public conversation. So I think that's something that I am quite conscious of myself, less so about sort of acting as a commentator, as important as I think that is as well. I mean, I would also say that I'm probably less worried about social scientific expertise losing authority in airspace to non-expert voices, on social media, really than I am about, more enduring forms of influence by other kinds of actors within society, the already powerful and wealthy, and I think, in my view, effectively challenging that kind of influence is not something about having the right or the best ideas necessarily. That's important, but it's also about kind of building sort of collective political forces to try and carry them forward. So I see that kind of influence as something that is sort of a collective civil society endeavor rather than an individual sort of a thing that particular researchers might try and engage in.
Thanks, Dylan, and I really am very pleased to hear and find very refreshing the perspective that for a lot of us, our most important influence will be on the people we train and sort of pass something on to and pay forward what we've learned from the people that have influenced us. I think that may not fit into too many annual review forms at Australian universities, but as you say, it may be one of the most important things, or if not the most important thing that most of us do. So maybe the rest of us should be trying to influence changing those annual review forms. But I'm glad that at least in your case they don't need to be. Glenn, let me come back to you. You've seen this issue of the public square and public debate from almost every vantage point, I suspect, but especially in including seeing it as being the steward of academic organisations, dealing with disparate perspectives, and a variety of different contributions and interventions by different faculty members. How have things changed over time, and what's your assessment of the current state of the public square at the moment?
Thank you. Let me first join you in saying how much I like Dylan's comment about students. Early in my career, I taught with a fabulous group of colleagues public policy at Griffith University, and travelling through an airport one day, I was stopped by a former student, a man called Gary Hargraves, who'd gone on into politics and had just become a minister in the Howard government. And he stopped and said hello, and he said, you know, all that stuff that you taught us about, you know, how policy is made and Parliament works and how the law works, he said with complete astonishment, it all turned out to be true. It's just a nice reminder that actually sometimes not only can we get it right, but it's understood to be helpful. Any leader of a university will tell you how scary it is when there's a controversy on and how much abuse gets thrown at senior academics who speak in public, and how important it is for the university to gather around that person or people and make it clear they have a right to speak. Never talked about, never in the media, but it is actually, particularly around climate, around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, it's very strong, and often around particular law reform issues. That didn't change in my time. Social media has given it a lot of amplification and a lot more opportunity for people to throw that sort of abuse. But when you have to have security looking after climate change academics because there's been death threats, which is not uncommon, we're in a very awkward space because, of course, free speech is just crucial. And the last thing you want to say to academics is, hey, you want to temper your comments because these are not reasonable responses to reasonable comments. These are quite out there. I find that particularly unnerving, and I know that my colleagues did as they experienced it. I was fortunate never to be on the receiving end. I was working with people who were. I guess the sort of broader question for me is, in the priorities that Mark Weston and his team have put that fabulous report together, State of Social Sciences 2021, and they have a series of priorities and then a series of grand challenges. And the first of the grand challenges is about the democratic deficit. And that's where I guess I get nervous. Because if you look over the long run, democracies don't survive. They don't last. Even the glorious Athens democratic moment is quite short. And they don't survive in large part because they become, debate becomes civil war by other means. And eventually they revert to authoritarian regimes because that's the only way to impose order on an otherwise fractious society. And democracy is always, therefore, that extraordinary balance you have to find between ability to argue and disagree and go to fundamentals and the fact that you do run the risk of your system breaking down. I don't think we're on the verge of that. But I think if you look historically, we're already quite a long-lived democracy, and you do wonder about trajectory, and therefore you wonder about whether the amplification on social media is a harbinger of where we're going, or simply the latest manifestation of an old pattern. If the latter, not a problem, but if an indication that we're going to divide into warring tribes, like so many democracies have, then a really worrying sign of where this might take us.
Okay, well, on that again, sort of balancedly depressing note about the end of the Australian Empire, such as it is. Let me pivot to the third question. So, and Jane Hall, I might ask this of you in the first instance. So, one thing that I think is quite notable is that advice to government comes a little bit less from government departments than it used to, and a little bit more from consulting firms than it used to. And even within universities, consulting firms are sort of used quite a lot more, although perhaps about more sort of routine or mundane operational matters that academics and social scientists might have less expertise over. But when it comes to policy making, and health policy would be one example, I think it's fair to say that social scientists are reasonably good at understanding how to speak to and influence members of the bureaucracy. Indeed, as a number of people have said, sometimes they were trained by us or with us. Does that change the landscape in terms of influencing public policy, in your view, Jane? And if so, what do we do about that?
I think it's clear that there's been a de-skilling of the public service, particularly at the federal level, in my experience, a de-skilling and an active discouragement that these people should think for themselves. And I think if you get that culture, it permeates into right through the organisation, so people are nervous to do it. But I do think there are and have been some extremely talented people in the public service. And I think one of the things we have to learn to do in trying to influence policy is know when to speak publicly and make it a very public debate that we might want to have about policy, and when we might talk quietly within the circle. And in my experience, some of the things that senior public servants have appreciated the most is small gatherings that are kept confidential and where they can explore ideas. And obviously, in my case, it's been with academics. But I have also seen times when those things have been repressed and discouraged. So there's this balance to achieve. I think one of the big dangers that we have, and this reflects too, I think, on the last question, is the pervasiveness of infographics. Everything can be summarized in an infographic. And whilst that may be good for getting over a message if you've only got, 90 seconds in the elevator type attention span, something is wrong with attention spans if that's all that they've got. And something is wrong when there's nothing behind that. And I've seen lots of big consultancy reports, and it's all infographics, very light on references, no argument, no taking apart. And that's what we've lost. I can see what the value of infographics is. I'm not saying we should get rid of them. They're all through our social sciences report, as those of you who've seen it will see. But we have to have substance behind that. Otherwise, we're just shouting at each other. And that gets back to the public square, that whoever shouts the loudest gets the most attention. It shouldn't be that. It should be whoever's got the better argument that is substantiated that gets the attention.
Jane McAdam, have you seen a change in how governments can and are influenced over your time at the Caldor Centre and what you've been doing in your work with refugees in particular?
I have, and I think I just wanted to add to Jane's comment. I mean, I think some of the kind of consultancy-based reports they lack depth, and it's sort of you come to the issue as though it's this new thing. You have a quick look around. This isn't everything, of course, but some of the reports that I've seen, and if that depth is also then missing institutionally from a particular department, then you don't know what you don't know. And I think in some areas in particular, there's been a huge loss of long-standing expertise, and you may have bright people there, but without knowing or understanding what came before, it can make it you're kind of operating in a vacuum. And I've found at different times there's been greater or lesser willingness in departments to engage directly with academics. I mean, I have tried to build relationships that are sustained ones, and to at least have the opportunity to provide briefings, to offer that to people, I think is important. Whether or not they're always taken up is another question. But I think something I find challenging too is then the follow through. So, one might release a policy brief and you'll have those initial discussions, but how then do you track what happens? And has the report kind of gone in, someone's glanced at the executive summary and then it's filed away on a shelf? And really, what is the academic's role there as well to maintain that, I guess, a more policy-driven agenda and to try and see the research translated into policy outcomes.
Thanks, Jane. That's very helpful. In this sort of whirlwind tour of leadership and actions and moving forward, I'm going to move to the fourth topic that we came up with, and I'm going to go to you, Dylan, in the first instance. One of the things I think we all think is important is building, sort of building and nurturing the social scientists of the future It's been suggested by many people, and this is actually in that wonderful report that Mark Weston spoke to yesterday and that Glyn just alluded to, that this starts as early as perhaps primary school and extends all the way through to how our junior faculty members in universities are supported. I think there's always an important question we should be asking ourselves about, and being, appropriately self-critical about what we can do differently and what we can do better, and perhaps what we can do more of the same of. Dylan, you seem uniquely well positioned to be able to speak to that in the first instance. How do we do that? How do we make the job of social scientists toward the start of their career, or even ones who are contemplating it as a career? How do we do better at supporting them?
I'm going to say something probably unsurprising, pretty simple, but also very difficult. I think the single best thing that we could do for nurturing future social scientists is to get better public funding for higher education. And this is the exact opposite of what's been happening in Australia for some years. But I think that would make a huge difference, to social scientists or budding social scientists, students, as well as everyone else in the university. So I think that would mean several things. So funding for students to study, increase public funding for study rather than forcing ever greater costs on students, providing secure jobs with fair and manageable workloads for both academic and professional staff. I think that would make a huge difference to people who are, social scientists who are working in universities, having manageable workloads, having secure jobs that are available, having good professional staff supporting them, rather than the pretty horrific spectacle we've seen of mass, sackings over the past couple of years, and the much longer trend towards job precarity and workload intensification in higher education. And then, the third part of it would be providing funding for research that's more generous, but also more fairly and sensibly distributed. The existing funding research funding schemes are, as I'm sure we all know, are hyper competitive, and colossally inefficient waste of labour for the overwhelming majority of people who apply. So I recognise, that this is not an easy proposition or a simple thing to do, and this is maybe a question for governments, but it's also something that I think that we as social scientists and as workers within universities should be struggling for and looking out for other allies to support that struggle as well.
So that's great and very helpful. Let me sort of zoom in on that funding question for the last few minutes we have, and make a small intervention and then go to the rest of the panel. So I fully agree with everything that you say, Dylan, but I'm an economist, so I get to make assumptions that don't necessarily have to be founded in reality, but that are sort of convenient. So in a nod to that disciplinary norm, let's just assume that there's not going to be any meaningful increase in public funding per se. Might be an increase in the way that governments, help underwrite loans through HECS and things like that. But imagine not much more government money or no more government money. And then start with the observation that I've made publicly many times, which is whether or not we're trying to compete with Harvard or Yale or Stanford in Australia, with universities with $40 and $50 billion US endowments. For sure, many universities in Australia are trying to compete with Boston University or Warwick or the University of California at San Diego, all of whom get about 5 times the fee revenue per capita that we get for domestic students in Australia. And we're in a global marketplace for faculty members and a global marketplace for students. So it doesn't seem that we can just rely on some kind of local monopoly. So to the rest of the panel, how do we break that? If we need a lot more, not a little bit more, but a lot more money into the funnel in Australian education, not so we can all just, have nicer lives and have someone to do our photocopying for us, but so that we can actually provide world-class education to our students who demand and deserve it, and attract world-class academics to help both develop knowledge and foster students. How do we do that?
That's a good question. And not surprising that you'd pose a question like that. I think one of the problems for universities is that they're becoming pioneers in the gig economy. And what we've seen is not just the casualisation of our teaching staff, but the outsourcing of teaching through online program management. And this is something that by and large is hidden from our students. They cannot see what they're getting. They get the university brand, but what lies behind it. And I think we should be putting a lot more effort into understanding what that is, what the implications of that are for the quality of education, not just for the staff and the scholars that we want to build. I think what we have also lost, I think what has been there in the way that research is funded is the belief that it should always be done on the minimum budget possible, and that therefore the people who work on research contracts are also gig workers. You should take the cheapest person off the street, use them, and then throw them away until you need someone else. And I think if we could change that atmosphere, if we could change it to a culture that was nurturing and developing, and it has to run right through the sector. It's not just the universities, it's also the funding agencies. That would make a big change. I think that apart from that, if we're going to raise more money, I think there will be a resistance to more fees in Australian tertiary education because people believe the government should pay for it. And indeed, surveys that have been done have suggested that many people are prepared to pay more through their taxes for health and education, not so much for submarines and some other areas of high government expenditure. So maybe we need to be better at explaining to people how taxes are spent, not just that thing you get when you file your tax return, but that there are different ways to pay, and you can pay for many things. You can pay through your taxes or pay out of pocket one way or another, and let there be a more serious debate about that. The Americans are lucky because they have such great philanthropic organizations and we don't, but maybe Glyn's going to change that.
So Glyn, am I wrong that we need more money to compete? And if I'm not, how do we do it?
Well, let's go with your assumption that there isn't going to be more money. And certainly if we've had no offers in the pending election from anyone for more money. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about casualisation. It's actually a symptom of the underlying problem here, which is we're trying to keep universities' traditional model of a university alive with less and less money. Casualisation is one of many strategies, as Jane said, that you hollow out the model just to try and keep it there. There has to come a point, and it's a really confronting point, in which you say the traditional teaching research university can't be funded on this basis, and we need to think about different sorts of institutions. That's confronting to all of us, doesn't matter where you are in the sector. And it's unpleasant if you've grown up with as you started by saying, with Harvard and Yale in your head. And we have to actually start to ask, are there completely different ways of organising tertiary education? Not for everyone, not all the time, but like, how do we get diversity into the system so that we can offer alternatives and better ways of looking after students than starving them of access to tenured staff and access to good researchers and all the things that make a great university, precisely because we can no longer afford to do it. the last thing I want to say about this is, at the start of COVID, we got lectured by Scott Morrison about how we needed to find a new business model, which was his language, as though the business model we currently have was the choice of universities and not the choice of Canberra. Canberra controls what we can charge, who we can enrol, where we can be. It is the most regulatory system in the country. In the sense against other sort of sectors where we might compare, and then to tell us that it's somehow our problem, rather than to say, since we control the funds, and they do, and you've now lost the only source of independent revenue you had, which was international students, instead of saying, so you're on your own, where was the agreement to come back and go to first principles and have the difficult conversation we needed to have about how we're going to keep a quality system with not enough funding? So if your premise is right, Richard, it's a tough time ahead.
Jane McAdam, you've seen this from a number of perspectives. We're running short on time, but let me give you the last word. What's your view on the way ahead?
Thanks. I mean, I just remarked too that I think, Jane's point about where taxpayer money goes as well. I think a lot of people still don't really understand what the Academy does. Even students see their lecturer teach for a couple of hours a week and assume that's all they're doing, and they're out having coffee the rest of the time. Quite clearly, that's not what's going on. And I actually think that's how Australia has managed, not having coffee, but how we've managed to sustain where we are in terms of, league tables, how we're punching above our weight, because people are so dedicated and committed to their students, to their research, to their faculties, and to the, the broader cause, I suppose, and people are burning themselves out trying to fulfill each of those components, and that's clearly not sustainable. But I know that without the amazing mentoring that I had from my lecturers and professors at university, I wouldn't have known even how to embark on a research career, what it would involve. And so I think it's fundamental that that mentoring continues, but it obviously has to be done in a sustainable way. So while I don't have answers to how we make that happen, quite clearly it's a top priority.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, and to all the panelists. This is a topic that I would love to keep talking about with all of you, and would love to engage the audience in more than we're able to in the strictures of the particular format. Let me just summarise for a minute before we draw things to a close, as this is the last session. I'll just take my prerogative quickly to thank again all the organisers of this, all the Academy staff, Chris Hatherley, Anna Dennis, and of course to Professor Kevin McConkey, who's been instrumental in organising this entire symposium, talking about not understanding and appreciating all the work that goes into making things happen. I have a little bit of insight into the work that went into making this symposium happen, and Kevin, you've done an extraordinary thing, and we owe you a real debt of gratitude, and I'm sure others will add to that. Just to summarise briefly at the end of this panel, let me just say I think this is a hugely important issue about the, if you like, the model for Australian universities going forward, and that, sort of bumbling along as we have and relying on dedication and goodwill. It's good to have dedication and it's great to have goodwill, but they get stretched and they only go so far. And I think whichever major party is in government after the next election will need to address this in a serious way. And I think both parties have some work to do in developing a plan to seriously address how we make the Australian tertiary education sector, not only in the social sciences, but more broadly, live up to what is often talked about what it is in terms of being as good as anywhere in the world, and what we all want it to be in a world that's increasingly competitive in all dimensions. I just want to say briefly that the Academy of Social Sciences is an organisation that not only recognises contributions that have been made by our fellows to scholarship and other contributions to the social sciences over time, but is increasingly under Jane Hall's leadership over the past few years and the great work of Chris Hatherley in the National Office, trying to be more outward facing. If you haven't listened to it, check out the Seriously Social podcast. Go to our website and look at the things that we're doing. Look at the State of the Social Sciences report and the website there at the way that we're trying to be more outward looking, in addition to recognising contributions made by our fellows. And I think it's going to be an exciting time in the years ahead for us to contribute to that. I'm going to throw back to Chris Hatherley to take care of wrapping up the symposium overall.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and thanks to all our panelists. I'm actually just playing the role of handing back over to our Symposium Organising Committee Chair, Kevin McConkey, to wrap up. But please, before I do, let me add my thanks to all of our speakers, all of our panelists over the last 2 days. Fascinating talks, fascinating insights, some big challenges for the social sciences. For those who've been with us this afternoon, if you haven't already seen it, please do go onto the Academy website and have a look at the State of the Social Sciences report, where we've tried to map out some of these issues and some of the challenges and some of the ways forward. But thanks again to all of our audience members over the 2 days. We'll be in touch. There's more to talk about. But for me, thank you. And please let me now hand over to Kevin McConkey to close.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to colleagues taking part in that last panel session. In this last 10 minutes of the anniversary symposium, I want to make 4 sets of comments, some of them procedural and some of them hopefully a little substantive. Before doing so, however, as others have done, I acknowledge the passing of Stuart McIntyre, an eminent and prolific historian, a former president of the Academy, and a very influential commentator on the nature and value of the social sciences. Now to my 4 sets of comments. First, of course, some thanks to the Academy's Executive Committee for taking the risk with this symposium, to the Symposium Committee for their ideas and efforts, to the National Office staff, especially Anna Dennis and Chris Hatherley, who used existing skills and developed new skills to ensure this happened, and also who managed me along the way. To the 52 speakers whose expertise and excellence has been on display, and indeed to the 788 registrants who have stepped into and out of the sessions as their interests and time have allowed. Second, let me address what comes next. Well, what comes next includes the video recording of the symposium being available on the Academy's YouTube channel from later this week. A book is planned to be based on the symposium to be published early next year. Certainly a consideration of further activities arising not only from this symposium, but from the wonderful State of the Social Sciences report. But perhaps most importantly, all of us taking forward the evidence, the ideas, and indeed the needed actions, whether it's into our laboratories, into our discourse, into the public domain. Most immediately, though, Chris would want me to remind you and to encourage you to complete a brief questionnaire about the symposium, which will go out to everybody later today. Third, I can't resist the opportunity to point to some themes that jumped out of me and make some illustrative reference to just some of the many excellent speakers. Rest assured, if I don't mention your name, I still love you. There's 5 themes that jumped out at me. One theme is the importance of strong evidence that is well communicated and sensibly used. We saw very many presentations reach to strong evidence, yes, of different types because of different disciplinary approaches. But that evidence has and is being used to determine appropriate activities and policies. Sometimes it's being ignored, but oftentimes it's being picked up wonderfully well. We have very strong evidence across our disciplines relevant to many of the issues that society is facing globally. Indeed, as Richard Bryant highlighted today with his Coping with COVID mental health program, based on exceptionally strong data and being used not only in Australia, but in many countries throughout the world. A second theme that jumped out to me is the need to work together, not only across the disciplines of the social sciences, but also with the disciplines of the sciences, the technologies, and the humanities. Now, it is extremely trite to say that this is easier said than done, but almost everything I heard pointed to a need to take this up with renewed vigor and indeed clearer focus. The chief scientist, Kathy Foley, yesterday made this point in her comments that success in areas such as dealing with the digital world in which we live, and transitioning to the new economy that we have to transition to will only be achieved if we work together. And earlier today, Debbie Terry pointed to many questions that can only be answered by ensuring that social science disciplines and many other disciplines are at the same table, bringing different perspectives to bear. Another theme, and perhaps an incredibly challenging one, is the need to understand and embrace change. Over the last day and a half, whether we look at our education system, our work trajectories, relationships between males and females, our social structures and organizations, or our country's role in international activities. And we covered all of those. One common thing is that change appears to be occurring faster and faster. And hand in hand with that, we see also a resistance to and a fear of change that's occurring. Hugh White's analysis of international relationships yesterday threw this into bold contrast in a very real way. It's clear, and we know it as social scientists, that change can lead people, societies, and inadequate governments to retreat into sloganizing a false certainty or to make appeals to some imagined past. It was clear from the presentations at discussions at our symposium that many of our disciplines can and must assist in what I call a conscious and conscientious approach to the future. We have a responsibility to ensure that base populism doesn't fill a vacuum created by an absence of appropriate information in the public domain. A fourth theme that I observed is the need to be much more future focused. We are excellent at looking at what has happened in the before and what is happening now. We struggle a little bit, and our training has struggled in helping us learn how to focus more on the future. As Sarah Pink highlighted today in her comments on emerging technologies, we have to focus on the future much more intentionally, and we have to do so with a clearer vision and a stronger voice. Indeed, Ros Croucher pointed out that this sometimes means knocking on doors and offering our expertise. Ros didn't quite say kicking the doors, but that's clearly a message. The days of simply sitting back and waiting and hoping that somebody will ask us whether we know anything that is relevant have passed. Glyn Davis just highlighted in the last session how we need to be more focused in getting social science information into the common discourse. I know how difficult it can sometimes be to take on the role of public intellectual. It can be scary, but it is important, particularly important for those of us at points in our career where we have little to lose. My final and essential theme, and one that is also picked up very forcefully in the State of the Social Sciences 2021 report, is that of reconciliation with First Nations peoples. We need to accept, those of us who are white fellas, we need to accept that genuine reconciliation needs to start with a reckoning and a commitment to truth-telling and truth-seeking, as John Maynard pointed out, with his usual power and his usual passion. In this respect, it's critical also that Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples and scholars work together in a true partnership to achieve reconciliation, a point that came out strongly in the comments of Maggie Walter. Let me leave to one side those 5 themes, and you'll have other themes that are jumped out at you, and return to my 4th and final overall comment. To me, there were many professional highlights of the symposium, but also to me, there was a personal highlight. Biami Williamson, an Indigenous early career colleague, gave his talk yesterday and listened to the talks of others while holding his 3-month-old daughter, Baralga. I'm told that Baralga very much enjoyed being involved. Her presence reminded me, however, that this symposium was about the social future of Australia. To my mind, the importance of carefully constructing that future based on informed evidence cannot be captured better than by being clear about and working toward the society that should be our legacy to Baralga and all of her brothers and sisters. So friends and colleagues, I thank you for your involvement. I close this 50th anniversary symposium and I say, finally, to my friend and colleague, Anna, we're done.